So let's jump right in. I'm also going to tell you I will not judge your math ability. I'm not going to look over your shoulder to see if you have the right answer. In fact, we're very unfocused on answers in this session. I'm not going to give you the correct answers, which is going to bug at least 2 people in here because you're going to want the answers. But instead, I want you to be focusing on what's your thought process. What does your brain have to do to contemplate the question, and what process would you go through to actually solve that? So let's jump in on page 22 with 2 sample 4th and 5th grade ISAT questions. And then you can move on to the 2 questions from SBAC from grade 4 on page 23. These are all real released sample items. So wherever you're at in your problem solving process, let's talk about a few of these questions. So first of all, I'm curious, what was your experience like? What was your thought process like solving the grade 4 and grade 5 ISAT questions on page 22? It's a pretty big hamster. It could be a very big hamster. What else? Okay, let's talk about that in just a minute, but I want to know, what was it like for you to try and solve that problem? Or both of those? Okay, I hear not a whole lot of thought, pretty easy, basic computation, okay, and pretty quick, right? You just kind of clipped through those pretty quickly. Now, you brought up an interesting thing, even though you were joking about the pets, but it is such a key point because this question is packed with bias. Okay? And what are we really trying to measure here? Is this an estimation question, a very weak measurement question, or your pre-knowledge of pets? And imagine being an ELL student, and how weird is the word hamster, a rodent pet that has the word ham, which is a food, right within. I mean, this is a really weird word. And then I've had lots of conversations with adults and kids alike about, well, my neighbor has a koi fish that weighs over 30 pounds, and what about a baby pony? A baby pony could be less than 30 pounds. So it goes back to that, what are we really trying to measure here? And there are bias groups that are taking a look at every question that is constructed through the consortium and taking a look at those questions and attempting to remove as much bias as possible. We'll never have a fully bias-free test because we're human, but I'm confident that we will have much less bias in this test than what we have experienced before, which is a real positive thing. Moving on to the SBAC questions on page 23, the one about the rectangle. After this session, I will have taught this one 36 times to over 1,000 educators across the state of Idaho, and I've been doing this little informal study, walking around and looking, and many folks do the same thing I did. You either draw a rectangle or you turn the answer box into a rectangle. And that's great. Students will still have scratch paper. They'll be able to draw rectangles and chart that out. But what is the key word in this question, and what's it really asking you to do? Explain. So this would maybe be key takeaway number 1 that's really important. We need to make sure students are prepared to provide short constructed responses about how they solved a question, not just getting at the right answer. That's not something that they've typically done in the types of math assessments that we've given in the past. So how will we grade that, or what will that look like? If you flip to the next page, every question that's been created so far has a rubric that's attached to it. And here's a sample rubric for that question. I think that the rubrics will continue to be strengthened as they move forward. For example, in this one, I provided a piece of feedback that I'd like to see more samples so that no scorer would think this is the only way to solve this question. Because how many of you cut it in half first or went about it a different way? And it does say down in full credit, that is the width of the rectangle with a correct process, not there are multiple correct processes, but I'd like to see more of those shown up in the sample. You will also see that you can get full credit and partial credit. And we've been asked some questions about, well, how will we know which is the part that they got partial credit on? Remember that it's an adaptive test, so based on that portion of whatever they got right and wrong, that takes them to the next adaptive portion, which will help to give us a more holistic look about what each student knows and is able to do with that knowledge. The swimmer's question is actually an animated question. Of course, you didn't see the animation, you were still able to solve it, so that's okay. If a student happens to be staring at the ceiling, they can still solve the problem. And you cannot replay it. I was worried about that because I have an 11-year-old that I'm pretty sure would spend 20 minutes watching the swimmers swim. You can watch it once, but this will be very interesting for us to be able to study. Does this help with test fatigue? We know how engaged students are with media and animation, and when they have a question like that popped in there periodically, will that help to re-engage them in the test-taking process? I wanted to say a word about artificial intelligence, or AI, which would be computer scoring beyond the traditional type of computer scoring that we've already been using with like A, B, C, D response. Initially, there was conversation about many of the short constructed responses being scored with AI, and they've really backed off on that, particularly in this next year when we're still kind of in pilot phase. We need to get to a place where we're very comfortable with that as a field, but I do believe we will be moving in that direction. I was really uncomfortable with this at first. I was imagining like a math guy in a closet, and he's like building these magical algorithms that would somehow be as smart as a table full of teachers, and it's actually quite the opposite. They've had thousands of teachers from across the country, including teachers from Idaho, that have been scoring items, and then they're looking at the commonalities amongst the human scoring and using that information to build the algorithms. And early reliability and validity studies are actually pretty impressive at the closeness of match that they're getting. But they'll continue to work on that and help the field to grow in confidence with AI scoring. So how are we going to score all of that is probably the next place that you go in your thinking. We pay Smarter Balance to administer the tests, and one of the great opportunities we'll have is that they will be bringing money back into the state for Idaho teachers to score some of those Idaho exams. And if you've ever been a part of AP scoring or direct writing assessment, it also becomes an excellent professional development opportunity to sit around and look at student work and talk with other teachers about how students are demonstrating their knowledge. So Idaho will be determining with the consortium what portion will be scored here in Idaho, and how we'll have to utilize the consortium network to have all of our scoring done. Let's take a few minutes to look at a couple sample high school questions. I don't want you to actually spend time solving them. We don't have time for it, and I'd probably have to pass out paper bags to some of you so that you don't hyperventilate at these high school questions. But take a look at the grade 10 questions on page 25 from ISAT, and then particularly spend the time we have looking at those two questions from SBAC on page 26. So I have to honestly tell you that the question at the top of page 26 may be my least favorite standardized assessment question of all time. And some of you are probably pretty excited about it as well, I'm sure. Let's talk about it, because there's some very interesting takeaways from looking at this particular question. The first time I was working with this question, it was with a group of 30 professional technical educators who are all very math-minded people, room full of really smart teachers, basically. We have this question up on the screen, and we're attempting to solve it together. This whole room of teachers missed the word sum, despite the fact that it's written in the question 6 times. And I'm betting at least a couple of you did as well. You immediately start to drag expressions that are less than 10, or between 10 and 20, until you get to the point that you realize there are not 9 answers. So I must be doing something wrong. The implication with that is that we are not used to close reading math questions. We're pretty used to skim reading them and getting right to the computation. And I think we really need to give students opportunities to be accessing multi-stepped problems that require close reading, because that is what they are going to be experiencing on the Smarter Balanced assessments. The other thing is that there are some tactile requirements that students have not really utilized before. What you have to do for this question is hover over an answer in that middle box, click, hold, drag, and drop. Okay, now a lot of kids do this real proficiently, probably more so than we do, but there are also students that haven't had much experience messing around with the mouse, and we want to make sure that they're getting opportunities to practice that. So with this group of teachers, we realized our mistake, and so we wanted to drag the options back, and I had the mouse and I was trying to drag them back and they wouldn't go, and I was immediately kind of like panicked, like, oh no, on this pretend question I'm not even being scored on. And I thought, I don't want students to feel this way. And what we figured out you have to do is click over the answer you want to remove, and then you see that little blue delete button at the top? Then you have to click on that. There are other things like this within their toolbox questions where students can draw a shape or do these types of things. They're not always super intuitive. Kids will figure it out, but they just need an opportunity to figure it out. On the Smarter Balanced website, which there's a snapshot of the home page and also the website address on page 52 in your notebook. You might want to dog-ear that page. If you haven't been to that website, I'd really encourage you to check it out. You can take a practice test yourself or have your students take a practice test at that website. I will let you know, if you take the full practice test, you don't get any feedback, which was kind of sad to me. It was kind of like, wah, wah, at the end of the test. I didn't get any feedback because I really wanted some. What you will get, where you can get feedback, is with the individual testing items. They've also released individual items for every grade level and content area. And within those, you can take a question, and then you have 4 choices. You can get more information about that item. You can look at the rubric, you can provide feedback, and you can score the item. And I would definitely encourage you to provide feedback, for example, about the rubrics that we talked about earlier. If you want to see something more in the rubrics, let them know. If this type of question you believe would be confusing, let them know. But be really specific about the feedback that we give. This question, my first feedback went like this. This is a terrible question and it will be confusing to students. Sent. And I felt great for about 30 seconds. And then thought about what I know about meaningful feedback and went back. I'm concerned about this question because it might be improved upon by, so the more specific of feedback that we give, the more useful that will be to the folks who are continuing to construct items. Let's talk about that one down at the bottom. What do you guys think? The decibels question? Yeah, I love your face. That's exactly what I thought. By the end of this, I didn't care about decibels. I had no idea what they were asking me to do, and I had to close read it 3 times to really try and get at what they were asking for. Again, just driving home that we really are going to have a need for students to close read math problems, to be able to provide constructed responses on the why and explaining how they're solving problems. The last thing that I want us to do as a quick group activity that can be really powerful to do with groups of teachers is on page 28. You see the 4 math claims listed there from the Math Standards document. And if you would, flip back to those first 2 ISAT questions that we took a look at on page 22. If a student had taken those 2 ISAT questions, which of the 4 claims would we have addressed? Okay, I hear a 1, except that we're in the parts of 1, but what key word are we really missing in those questions? Explain, because there's no explaining or interpreting. Number 2 is probably the one we could most closely justify, although it might be considered a weak example of complex, well-posed problems in pure and applied mathematics. But we could maybe argue 2, and 3 and 4 definitely not. Do the same exercise within the 2 SBAC questions on page 23. Which claims are covered there? All four. And this is an observation that trends, not across every item, but majority of ISAT items are at that very objective level and maybe hit 1 claim, and most SBAC questions measure multiple claims, often 3 or 4 of those claims. And this is a huge benefit. While we're talking about some of the challenges, like it not being a timed test is great for students to have lots of time to demonstrate their ability, and it's a scheduling challenge for principals and schools. That's a challenge. We can work through those things together, but I hope we're also talking about the real benefits, and this is a huge one. Within ISAT, out of very small question banks, the average student in Idaho would access about 34 questions on any given content grade level ISAT exam. So if you think of like a big oak tree, you're clear out on a branch assessing what a student knows based on 34 little objective questions or items, compared to with having SBAC will have a bank of over 50,000 test items to choose from, and most of those measuring multiple claims, up to 3 or 4 claims. So you're getting like this whole huge big branch of the oak tree in being able to look at what students really know, and most importantly, what they can do with that information. So that's a huge benefit. This is a great exercise to do with teachers, to let them see side by side. One of those benefits is to exactly what it's measuring and what it will show us about what students know and are able to do. All right, you have survived the challenge courses.